Good morning, everyone. My name is Cesar Alesi Perez. I'm a research associate with the Higher Education Center at the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program today, featuring the findings from our latest PPIC report, Tracking Progress in Community College Access and Success, which focuses on the impact of Assembly Bill 705 on community colleges and sheds light on both the immense progress made and remaining areas in need of further reform. For those interested, the report, technical appendix, policy brief, as well as the slides from today's presentation are all available on our website at ppic.org. This research and event are supported with funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Sutton Family Fund. We'd like to thank them for their support. And as a reminder, PPIC is a public charity and does not take or support positions on any ballot measures or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. Now, for today's virtual briefing, I will present the main findings from our report and then answer some audience questions. So if you do have a question, please send it and make sure to include your name and organization to the email address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And with that, I will now begin the presentation. The report for which this presentation is based is co-authored by myself, my colleagues Marisol Cuellar Mejia, Sidronio Jacobo, Fernando Garcia, and Olga Rodriguez. My co-authors and I would like to send a special thank you to our California Community College System partners. This research would not be possible without the student-level data provided by the Chancellor's Office. Now, I'd like to first start by providing some context for this report. As many of you know, AB 705 implementation began in the fall 2019 term, requiring that colleges maximize students' chances of completing gateway transfer-level English and math courses within 1 year by implementing course placement reforms. Before AB 705, most students were required to take remedial courses, but these course sequences often took a long time and many students would drop out. And so the goal of this reform was to eliminate this barrier for students to complete this critical early milestone in achieving their academic goals, including earning a degree or transferring to a four-year university. Promisingly, our previous work on AB 705 has shown that it has already dramatically transformed access in community colleges. However, implementation was uneven across the state. As a result, AB 1705 was signed last year, and funds were appropriated in last year's budget with the goal of supporting a comprehensive and equitable implementation of AB 705. In short, the law explicitly requires community colleges to not only place students directly into transfer-level English and math courses, but also ensure that students actually enroll and are supported in those courses. This additional legislation acknowledges that there is still substantial room for improvement in this space, including increasing course completion rates and reducing persistent racial equity gaps. In effect, it begins to shift the focus of reform from removing barriers to access toward improving opportunities for students to succeed in key transfer-level coursework. And so our first goal with this report, now that we have data up until the fall 2022 term, is to examine and explain trends in access and completion in transfer-level courses, hopefully helping to inform where progress has been made and what the necessary areas of further reform are. So the first thing I want to note is that while the pandemic had a drastic effect on enrollment, numbers promisingly seem to bounce back a bit in fall 2022. So here we show annual percent changes in fall enrollment counts over time. So for example, the last three bars we see represent the change from fall 2021 to fall 2022. In 2020 and 2021, we see large declines in enrollment among all groups of students due to the pandemic. In 2022, as I mentioned, enrollment increased, though as you can see, enrollment growth was larger among first-time English students than first-time math students. Now, focusing just on English, we see here in yellow that the share of first-time English students directly enrolling in a transfer-level course for their first English course has increased dramatically as a result of AB 705. Specifically, the share starting in transfer level jumped from 68% to 95% from 2018 to 2019. And promisingly, these rates have remained high. In English, direct enrollment in transfer level reached 99% in 2022. Now in blue, we see that one-term completion rates had also increased significantly over time due to early implementation of placement reforms, with the large jump in 2019 after access increased dramatically. However, since then, as room for growth and access has diminished, throughput rates, which we define here as one-term course completion rates, have remained unchanged from fall 2019 to fall 2022, staying at about 59%. Now, among first-time math students, the share directly enrolling in transfer-level courses increased twofold in 2019. from 40% to 79%. In the next 2 years, we saw gradual increases in access and a big jump in 2022, with access reaching 95%. Completion rates followed a similar trend, with a big jump in 2019 as access increased dramatically. Unlike what we saw in English, however, the share of students directly enrolling in transfer-level courses only reached 79% in 2019, leaving some room for growth in access after system-wide implementation. As a result, while completion changed little as access remained stable in 2020 and 2021, a big increase in access in 2022 led to an increase in throughput from 46% to 51%. So while this is promising, we should also still keep in mind that this means that about half of first-time math students are still not completing a transfer-level course in one term. And so in line with the goals of AB 1705, it is clear that more needs to be done to increase completion rates. In our report, we go more in depth on how increases in access to transfer-level English and math have accounted for a smaller and smaller share of increases in throughput as the state reaches universal access to these courses. And consequently, we conclude that additional improvement in course completion will need to come from reform in areas outside of access, addressing the specific needs of students. So this can include changes within classroom. For example, something that's very necessary is instructor and department level reforms to curriculum and pedagogy. At the same time, resources are needed to ensure faculty are able to access training and professional development opportunities, as well as collaborate with their colleagues through communities of practice. Academic and non-academic supports are also important. Co-requisite courses that provide link support for transfer level coursework and expanded opportunities for tutoring can help address students' academic needs, while expanded access to mental health counseling as well as financial resources could help address students' non-academic needs. Now, while completion rates need to be improved system-wide, reducing the equity gaps between racial and ethnic groups is also a key concern. As we see here, one-term course completion rates in transfer level English have increased for all student groups, but the gaps between groups remain. And as we saw earlier, there have been no significant increases in completion rates among any groups since 2019. These trends and gaps look similar among first-time math students, with the exception that completion rates have continued to increase for all groups after 2019, as access rates have continued to climb after initial implementation of AB 705. Nonetheless, the gaps between Latino and Black students and their Asian and white peers are actually larger now than they were pre-AB 705. Now, in this chart, we examine these gaps more closely. So the solid lines are showing racial gaps in English completion, which decreased in 2019 and have remained stagnant since, while the dotted lines represent gaps in math completion, which peaked in 2019, but have also remained stagnant since. Gaps between white and Black students are shown in blue, and gaps between white and Latino students are shown in yellow. So looking at the blue lines, we see that white-Black gaps in math and English were about 22 percentage points in 2022 and have not changed much since AB 705 implementation. This means that first-time Black math and English students are 22 percentage points less likely to complete their course in one term than their white peers. Now, looking at the yellow lines, as of 2022, we see that Latino students are 17 percentage points less likely to complete math and 16 points less likely to complete English in one term compared to their white peers. So in summary, while disparities in access have narrowed significantly, we have yet to see large declines in gaps in completion between racial and ethnic groups as a result of AB 705. So eliminating these disparities will require identifying the needs of Black and Latino students and implementing effective initiatives and programs that address those needs and help students succeed. In an effort to try to learn what these strategies might be, we interviewed faculty and administrators and performed a case study analysis of 10 community colleges that we identified as having positive and equitable outcomes in math among Black or Latino students post AB 705. While our report has more information on our qualitative methods and findings, I'll just briefly provide an overview of some of our results. So the first thing, I guess, perhaps unsurprisingly, institutional support for reform was key at these colleges, seeing positive and equitable outcomes. This involved strong leadership and buy-in among staff at all levels, a collective growth mindset, and an institutional emphasis on providing crucial financial support and resources needed for organizational restructuring and professional development opportunities for faculty. Relatedly, organizational collaboration, such as in the form of communities of practice and through data-driven decision-making, was essential at our case study colleges, helping identify and address gaps and areas in need of improvement at the college, department, course, and classroom level. Lastly, at a smaller level, high-touch, holistic, student-centered programs such as Umoja and MESA proved to be crucial in supporting Black and Latino students specifically, providing space for community, counseling, and mentorship. Another way that colleges have attempted to improve completion rates and address equity gaps is through co-requisite support courses, which are linked to the transfer level course and provide supplementary classroom time and instruction for students needing additional academic support. Here, we show the share of first-time English and math students that enrolled in co-requisites over time. The first thing to note is that co-requisite enrollment was very low pre-AB 705 and saw a large increase in 2019 after system-wide implementation of AB 705, highlighting a deliberate shift from prerequisite remediation to co-requisite remediation. Post-AB 705, however, enrollment has declined slightly in English and was also declining in math until increasing again in 2022. While there may be many reasons for this stagnation, we have learned from our interviews that colleges and faculty may have either postponed plans to add co-requisite courses or stopped offering them outright during the pandemic as they became more difficult to implement effectively in a remote learning environment. Now, the reason some colleges have embraced co-requisite courses is because there is increasing research outside of California showing that they can lead to improved outcomes, especially in these key critical gateway courses. So far, however, outcomes have been mixed among the state's community colleges. Here we look at the distribution of fall 2022 completion rates for students enrolled in co-requisites among colleges with at least 30 students enrolled in such support courses. So in English, we find that the typical college has a 54% completion rate, but this ranges from 23% to 73%. In math, the typical college has a 49% completion rate with an even larger range between 20 to 97% across colleges. So there are colleges with promising results, but also many colleges with lower success rates, highlighting large room for improvement and not just scaling academic supports, but in implementing and designing them to best address student needs and promote success. So although a lot of progress has been made, there's still substantial room for improvement in increasing completion rates, reducing equity gaps, and improving current support models. In this next section, we look at longer-term outcomes to examine whether reforms have ultimately helped students along the transfer pathway and ultimately achieving their academic goals. To this end, we begin this analysis by looking at 3-year outcomes among fall cohorts of first-time math students, starting from when they took their first math course. So for first-time math students in fall 2019, the first cohort impacted by AB 705, we look at their outcomes up until the fall 2022 term. Now, jumping into our initial results, this figure displays the distribution of 3-year outcomes among cohorts of first-time math students. Looking at the orange bars, the first thing we see is that 3-year transfer rates have increased slightly from 15.8% in 2015 to 20.4% in 2019. Now, if we combine transfer with the blue and yellow outcomes, which represent students who earned a degree and students who obtained our proxy for transfer-ready status, which means they completed 50 or more transferable units, and other milestones that increase their likelihood of transferring, we see that a growing share of students are at least achieving this transfer-ready status. However, looking at the gray bars, which represent students who are not transfer-ready and are leaving the system, we see that this share has stayed the same, almost half for the last several years. Still, we should note that the pandemic inevitably impacted these long-term outcomes, especially given that it affected the 2019 cohort more than it did previous cohorts. And so in light of this, it is encouraging that the fall 2019 cohort achieved a higher 3-year transfer rate than earlier cohorts that were less affected by the pandemic. Accordingly, these very early results suggest AB 705 may have actually buffered the impact of the pandemic on transfer rates. Now, looking at 3-year transfer rates by race and ethnicity, we see slight increases among all groups over time, but large gaps between groups remain, similar to what we saw with one-term completion rates. However, as I noted before, we are still in the early stages of this long-term analysis. We currently only have one AB 705 cohort, the fall 2019 cohort, and thus in our future work, we look forward to analyzing outcomes among later cohorts, especially as the effects of the pandemic presumably decline over time. So just to conclude, AB 705 has dramatically transformed access to transfer-level courses at California's community colleges. With the state nearing universal access, the focus must now shift to completion, as 40% of first-time English and half of first-time math students are still not completing the course in one term, and large equity gaps persist. Promisingly, as we've begun to see through our case study analysis, there are initiatives and strategies that seem to be effective in improving outcomes and reducing equity gaps. Still, much more work is needed to uncover what is working at colleges with successful outcomes. In addition, what programs successful colleges are implementing may be less important than how they are implementing and leveraging them to effectively address the needs of specific groups of students. To this end, expanding communication and collaboration across programs and colleges may be necessary to eliminate statewide equity gaps in gateway course completion that have thus far limited the potential impact of AB 705. Lastly, more research is needed to understand the longer-term effects of AB 705. On one hand, our very early results suggest that AB 705 may have buffered the impact of the pandemic on transfer, but they could also suggest that significantly broadening access to gateway math and English alone will not guarantee dramatic gains in longer-term academic success. As we've seen, California's community colleges have taken a momentous stride forward and have given students a better chance of succeeding in their academic goals. In the coming years, additional efforts to support students in completing not only their early milestones for transfer, but also every step along the way will help amplify the impact of AB 705 and further promote student success. And with that, I will end the presentation portion of the program and transition it back to me to answer audience questions. Just a reminder, if you do have a question about this report or research on AB 705, please send an email along with your name and organization to the address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. Okay, so we got one question from Annabelle Rosser from Atlas Public Policy. She asked, given AB 1705 provides one-time funding to support the implementation of AB 705, is it likely that additional funds will be needed to maintain the progress made in completion rates and to address equity gaps? That's a great question. So yeah, I think additional support or constant support will be needed. I do want to get into a little bit about that. Since I kind of just briefly touched on that in the intro about what that funding is. And so just to provide some specifics, the funding establishes the California Community College Equitable Placement Support and Completion funding allocation included in the 2022 Budget Act. This May, the Chancellor's Office provided a list of approved funding activities, which included developing co-requisite support models, which included providing faculty with time to design, implement, and evaluate their co-requisite support courses. As we saw from this research, a lot of work is needed in that space. There's also funding to provide professional development for faculty, including training on equity-minded teaching practices and providing spaces for community to practice. There's also funding, or one of the things that was outlined was aligning concurrent student support services. So not just thinking about co-requisite courses, but how do we maybe embed support into non-academic supports into the classroom, expanding or developing support labs, tutoring centers, embedded tutoring. And so there's a lot of activities that this one funding can provide. And I think one of the goals is to also do research on what works and hopefully inform where we can spend future funding, because that will definitely be needed, of course. But yeah, I think that this initial funding is critical, and it provides colleges with some flexibility and ability to test what might work, and hopefully that informs and motivates future funding. Let's see. So we have another question from Oakland that says, it sounds like you were able to interview faculty in this research, but not students. If you were able to speak with students as well, what else do you think you could learn? So that's a great question. So that's right. So in our case studies and actually in previous work that we've done, we've only really talked to faculty, staff, counselors, college and district administrators. Doing interviews with students is really important, and something that's a little bit more challenging. There are other organizations that have done great work with student surveys, and we've definitely used that work to try to inform some of our research. But there are a lot of things that I think we'd like to learn. And then just going back to what I was talking about in terms of the one-time funding and the things that might be funded to help colleges support students in these gateway courses and along the transfer path and in meeting their academic goals. I think it'd be great to get a student perspective on what types of supports work best for them. What do they think about co-requisite supports? What do they think about other types of academic supports like embedded tutoring? And then in what ways do they see those as helping them achieve their goals, helping them complete these courses? Another thing, though, besides academic supports, it'd be really important to know what non-academic supports are critical. We know from other research that a lot of students that aren't passing these gateway courses are also not passing other courses. They're also struggling just generally in their community college journey. And so that, while that might on one hand show that broader academic supports are needed, not just in these gateway courses, it also shows that there might be other things. It also might indicate that there's financial need, there's resource-based needs, need for mental health or other types of counseling. And so identifying what those needs are and hearing that firsthand from students will be really important, not just to inform our work, but to inform things like this one-time funding allocation, right, and where those funds go. So definitely something that I think we'd like to do maybe in the future, or at least learn from and see how we can incorporate student voice in our future projects. Okay, so we have another question from Sacramento. It says, you presented information on how one-term throughput rates have changed in the last several years. Do you have any information of the trends in completion rates disaggregated by SLAM versus BSTEM? Yeah, so that's a great question. I don't know if we go into that much detail in this report. We've definitely covered that in previous research on AB 705. So for those of you interested, please feel free to check those reports out. So one thing that so just to clarify, so SLAM includes courses like statistics and liberal arts, math courses. BSTEM includes the calculus sequence and courses like trigonometry. And this is the path that a lot of students take when they want to major in engineering or science, for example. And so the first thing that I'll know before talking about completion rates is just this trend that we've seen in terms of the share of students, the share of first-time math students enrolling in these pathways. And so over time, and probably one of the effects of AB 705, we've seen a larger share of first-time math students starting in SLAM courses or SLAM pathways instead of BSTEM pathways. And so we've seen I think now 60% of first-time math students starting in transfer level are starting in SLAM, and about 40% of students starting in transfer level math are starting in a BSTEM pathway. So that's one of the biggest trends I think that we see is in terms of where students are or what pathway students are taking. In terms of completion rates, we do see that students in SLAM courses have higher one-term course completion rates. So I think we see about a 56% completion rate among SLAM students. And in BSTEM, we see about a 49% rate in one-term course completion. Both of these have fluctuated over time, seeing an initial decrease from 2015 to 2019 after system-wide implementation of AB 705 began. So success rates declined a bit as students who were once placed in remediation or below trans-level courses began starting in trans-level courses and more frequently in SLAM pathways. Then completion rates, I think, increased in 2020 and were actually almost identical between SLAM and BSTEM. And then since then, I think we've seen SLAM kind of stay at around 56%, and then BSTEM has declined a little bit. So there are some things that we're noticing in terms of differences in completion rates. But again, I think the main thing is where students are choosing what type of pathway they're choosing to start their math career in the community college, I think is what's been most interesting. Let's see if we have any other questions. Okay, so we have one question that says, what questions will you be able to answer with additional data from future cohorts? That's a great question. So yeah, we have, so we go a little bit more in depth in the report and the appendix on things that we try to do to get towards a causal analysis with the long-term outcomes. As I mentioned briefly, the pandemic obviously affects outcomes, especially of our only AB 705 cohort, the 2019 cohort of students. And so we can't really claim causality in our analysis. I think doing the descriptive and some of the other analysis where we try to control for student and academic characteristics is important and gets us a little closer. But of course, once we get more years of data, hopefully the effects of the pandemic will lessen on those cohorts, and we can actually compare pre-AB 705 cohorts in terms of their transfer rates or degree completion or just being transfer ready. We can compare pre-AB 705 cohorts with post-AB 705 cohorts that are less impacted by the pandemic. And so that's something I think that we're looking forward to, is just getting a little bit more away from the effects of the pandemic, since we know, and we have other research that shows that in 2020, 2021, the pandemic greatly affected enrollment and persistence among continuing students. And so that we're limited in what we can say. And so, yeah, we're definitely looking forward to getting more data. Let's see. Yeah, we have another question on how the pandemic impacted your results in terms of longer term outcomes. So again, yeah, I think that the persistence, we can't really isolate those effects because it happened at the same time, almost at the same time that AB 705 was implemented system-wide, and definitely affected those one-year outcomes among that first cohort of AB 705 students. And so I think that enrollment and persistence across terms, and then also we know it affected students that were enrolled and how difficult it was for them to access their courses and pass their courses in a remote and online setting. So we do have those effects on enrollment and persistence, but even among the students that did persist, they faced many challenges that were academically focused or non-academically focused. And we can't really isolate those effects since it affected all students at the same time and in different ways. And so, yeah, I think, again, just looking forward to getting more years of data. Okay, so we have another question from the Bay Area that says, in your presentation, you mentioned that there's wide variation in terms of completion rates among students in co-requisite courses across colleges. What about the distribution of one-term completion rates among students who took the translevel course without co-requisite support? Do you see similar variation? Okay, so that's a great question. So yeah, so just to clarify, so I showed a chart, and we actually do in the report compare over time the distribution of outcomes at the college level in terms of co-requisite course outcomes, one-term course completion outcomes versus students that were not in co-requisite courses, so standalone or unsupported courses, so courses that didn't have a co-requisite link to it. And so we actually do see similar variation in one-term completion rates between co-requisite and unsupported courses. In terms of just the wide range of outcomes across colleges, with some colleges having lower throughput rates in English and math and others having high throughput rates. But the median throughput rates are higher in standalone courses, and the distributions are shifted up. So basically the floor is higher in standalone courses versus co-requisites. And there is correlation between co-requisite and standalone course outcomes. But there are some colleges, and we mentioned this in the report, that see better outcomes in co-requisites actually than in standalone courses and vice versa. So just a lot of variation there in many aspects, as might be expected, given that there's wide variation in student distributions enrolled in these courses, and the action strategies and approaches taken at the college level. So again, I will plug in our report. We do compare the distribution of outcomes in co-requisites with standalone courses over time. So for those interested, please check that out. Let's see. I think this will be the last question. We only have a couple minutes. From Sacramento, it says, did your study find different strategies implemented in the colleges with good outcomes for Latinos relative to the strategies implemented in colleges with good outcomes for Black students? Okay, so that's a great question. I don't think I'll be able to answer that fully in 2 minutes. We do go in a little, we do outline our findings in the report. One thing I will say that was interesting though, is that when we, at least from our findings, and again, we did a case study analysis with 10 colleges, 5 colleges with equitable outcomes among Black students, 5 colleges with equitable outcomes among Latino students. And so one thing that was interesting is that, at least in the case studies of colleges focusing on Black students, they all identified specific programs at their campuses that were tailored to meet the specific needs of the Black students on their campus. Each college had an Umoja program aimed at enhancing the cultural and educational experience of Black students. They also specifically acknowledged that Black students and their success were institutional priorities, and that shared commitments, which drove them to specifically highlight their success and promoting their success as an important goal at their program. And on the other hand, our case studies on colleges focuses on Latino students. They're more likely to cite broader campus level approaches as critical to improving student success, less likely to talk about these specific programs. And some of that could be because at a lot of these colleges, Latinos made up a large share of students. And so when they were identifying programs that helped Latino students, they're thinking of, in their mind, they're thinking about identifying things that benefited students more broadly on their campus. And so that's something that I think we'd like to dive deeper a little bit and do a little bit more rigorous qualitative analysis to find out what's going on here. And again, we don't, our findings are only for these 10 colleges, and so it would be interesting to see what's happening at other colleges and colleges maybe that are struggling a little bit with these outcomes. And so, yeah, still a lot to be learned there, but definitely an interesting tidbit that we got from those interviews. So I think that wraps us up. We're at time. Please feel free to email me or any of my co-authors if you have additional questions. Again, I would like to thank our funders for supporting this work and this program, and all of you for joining us online. And if you pre-registered for this event, later today, you will receive a survey. So we greatly appreciate you taking a couple minutes to respond, to let us know how we did. But yeah, thank you again, and I hope you guys all have a great rest of your day.